Now, is anyone scouting deer out there this year? And I think most of us are. Some of you might have that favorite rut stand. You just go in, slam a monster buck every November, and that's it. You don't have to scout, you don't have to do anything. But for a lot of us, we're putting our time and effort into whether it's scouting public land, preparing our private land. And I wanted to talk about a concept that I wrote about back in the 2000s, a long time ago. It was in my book, but I talk about layered bedding and that bedding opportunity. And this explains where you should scout, why, how it affects your hunt, and ultimately how it affects the potential of your private land or the potential of your land, your hunt on public land. Layered deer bedding. It all starts with food. You can't have layered bedding without food. Everything's random then. Without food, everything's random. Without food, you can only capture 20% of your hunt if you're on a private parcel, your 20% of your potential of your hunt, your potential of your herd. You have to have quality food, and the only quality food you can have is food plot at that point. That's only, honestly, a food plot. You know, ag lands are always forever changing. They could be disked in, tilled in, plowed, picked, always changing. And so they never complement a certain area of cover the same from year to year. And for that, you can never hunt or manage a consistent deer herd, and your potential is severely limited. Food sources right here. You can see these two right here. I'm going to try to illustrate this. Let's say these two food sources are 600 yards apart. And we'll just use this as an average example of, say, a mixed ag land area, somewhere typical in upper Midwest, central part of the country over to the east. You have those food plot or ag fields, and then people managing with food plots. And when I'm saying food, I'm referring to food plots directly. So what happens is that first layer, let's say on the outside of this is non-deer habitat. We'll say open hardwoods, open fallow fields, neighborhood, school, whatever it might be. So there's really no potential of bedding this way. So those bedding layers take place in an ever increasing arc all around that food source. The larger the food source, the more power that the bedding opportunity will increase from that food source, and the more bedding potential. The more linear the food source, the more bedding opportunity, because then deer don't have to go a long ways into cover to bed, and those first deer that will take that bedding layer up are does and fawns. So does and fawns will take this layer over here. If you have a long food source, then they'll stretch all the way around that food source. If your food source is larger, if your food source is broken up, if you have elevation change in your food source, I don't recommend grid patterns and patterning, planting different things in that food source. I find there's not that great of a difference. Really using the lay of the land, having outside corners, little valleys in the food source or coves where deer can hide from each other. A lot of times you can do that by the shape of your food plot instead of adding a lot of work and creating plantings in between. Sometimes in a long food plot like this, you might have a center line of switchgrass, separates deer from one side or the other, separates your plantings. But bottom line, you can expect those does to take over that first layer. Now what happens in that situation is you start creating almost dead spots of no doe movement, because does have a very small home range. So why would those does bed 300 yards back into the middle of that cover if they have plenty of cover next to that food source? And the answer is they don't. They want to bed as close to that food source as possible. Most does that I find, if you have adequate bedding on the food source or near the food source, then they're going to bed within 50 to 100 yards at the most. It all starts with screening around that food source right here. That invites deer to bed closer in the form of does and fawns. And so you can really fill this first layer with does and fawns. So let's say this property was an 80-acre parcel. You have that 600 yards in between your food sources, and that goes in there. Then you have the opportunity to create doe bedding here, which is point number one of this. So you have layered doe bedding. You can't have doe bedding without those food sources, consistent doe bedding the entire season. So you want this area to be full of does, and that's that first layer. Now you're creating a dead space of no does in between there. And that's awesome, because now you have room for bucks. That buck could bed here. Now if your neighbor had a stand right here and was very intrusive, might push that buck to bed right back in here. But he's still gonna bed, you still have cover on your land. You have room for bucks to bed in here. Now, the science says that bucks have a 3-mile home range. You can never hold bucks on 80 acres, and I'm here to tell you that is dead wrong. I'm here to tell you, as someone who tries to influence a herd, hunt a quality herd, and has done it for decades, that thought is wrong as it relates to daylight movement. Bucks move a long ways under the cover of darkness, but they have their preferred areas that are 200 to 400 yards, 500 yards away from a food source in a typical area, and that's where they're going to bed. And that's why you can be the herd influencer in the neighborhood with 80 acres, let alone 40 or 30 or 20 acres. It really doesn't take much because deer do not move that far during the daylight hours in the average property. So layered deer bedding, when you have food sources, it creates the opportunity for doe bedding, and then it creates the opportunity for buck bedding if you have that left over. If you don't have quality cover in between food and bucks, then you're not going to have those bucks there because those does are going to take over that first quality cover. Let's say it was in the middle of your property. Then you're not going to have with that open space. And then those does, do they even hit that food source before dark when they have to go through open timber to get there? So you have to have decent cover. Not perfect, but decent cover going all the way back to that core area. And does it make sense? The doe bedding cover is actually more important than the type of habitat the bucks are bedding in. If you give does and fawns food and you give them adequate bedding opportunity with the type of habitat you have, if you have screening around your food plot, if you have hinge cuts, if you have timber harvest, I recommend hinge cuts in about 20-25% of parcels, but it's a way to create bedding opportunity. If you have thick conifer around that food plot, but there's no daytime forage or food within that conifer, you can create pockets, allow for early successional growth in the forms of forbs, forages, shrubs, hardwood regeneration, non-conifer, non-grass, because you want some type of browse in there. That's a way that you can fill this area. The habitat here is more important than the habitat right here, because if you have food, you have screening, you have does, you'll have bucks if there's enough area left over, especially if you don't have an access trail going right through it like this in the middle of it. Then you destroy everything. So doe bedding with these layers, food creates doe bedding, then buck bedding. The same can be said on private or public land. The difference on public land is you might have 15,000 acres on public land, 20,000, 10,000, and deer really space out because they can. They don't like being on top of each other, but they will when they have to be, when they're used to it, when they're confined to that. And you can layer them very tight on private land and even on small parcels. But on public land, think more like half mile, 3/4 mile, mile instead of 200 yards, 400 yards, 500 yards for those individual layers. Same thing though, you find a quality clear cut in southern areas where clear cuts grow very fast and they get too thick. That first 1 to 3 years is optimum, maybe 4 years at the most. In some cases, you're looking at 5, 6, 7 years in a southern Ohio area, southern Illinois, West Virginia, Kentucky area, Arkansas, down into Oklahoma. I'm saying these states because I have people on YouTube that say, hey, thanks for mentioning my state. So someone said that about Arkansas the other day, so we'll throw that in again. But those southern areas, vegetation grows faster and those clear cuts fill up faster so that deer can't move through them and the browse is above head level. When you get up north, an aspen clear cut could last for 7, 8 years before that browse is above deer level and still provide a lot of cover, maybe even 10 years. Hardwood regeneration, true hardwood, hard maple, cherry, that type of regeneration takes a long time. In fact, you might not see deer using it for 2 to 3 years. So it's a little bit different than the south. And you look in there when you're comparing public land. But use that clear cut just like you would a giant food plot or an ag field that's located in a wilderness of cover. If you put 80 acres of corn up in some UP swampy area with a little bit of hardwood rise, you'd have every deer from 10 miles around hitting that cornfield and there wouldn't be much left, but they would hit it and be attracted to it. And that clear cut is not really that much different, especially if you find those lone clear cuts here or there on someone's property surrounded by public land. It can be an incredible spot, let alone those patchwork of management, state land, and sometimes federal. Federal doesn't seem to cut it much, but it's the same thing. You're just looking at a larger balance. There's no set number. Anyone says that there's a set number, a food plot space, percentage of cover that you should have, percentage of beans in your fields, percentage of hinge cuts, just percentage, a certain distance that deer will bed from food, just run like the wind. There's no set number in anything that has to do with deer management. What there is set is a balance in the concept. And so the concept on public land is a lot bigger. And when you find that food source, whether on public land, you create it on private land, you have doe bedding, you have buck bedding, now you can determine where your access goes. So obviously if I have that food source, I'm not accessing right through the food source to get back here to land. I'm coming in from a side route to get into a stand right here, wait for those bucks to come back. They're going through does. They're on that outside layer of doe, so a stand like that right there can give you a cruising opportunity where a buck might cruise that doe habitat, never step in he just goes back to his cover. You're right in that wheelhouse right there. Maybe you come around here for a different wind. Maybe you're here. Maybe there's a swamp here that funnels deer around the top side. So you're setting up a stand right there with a pinch point. Those deer either have to go in the inside or on the outside. In areas like this, you can have double movement. They're coming back from food this way, coming back from food this way. You're setting right there. You're creating a mock scrape, maybe a water hole in a dry area, and it gives you that opportunity for a stand assemblage because you can have morning stands back here, and then you could have evening stands right here, or deer coming out of that. Maybe they hit a mock scrape or a water hole, and they're going right back into the food source. So lots of opportunities for doe bedding, buck bedding, access determined by the doe bedding and buck bedding and how their movements are. And then once you have your access routes to determine, it gives you those stand opportunities for morning areas back here by bedding, evening, afternoon sits back here closer to food, maybe those in-between areas for daytime cruising, all-day cruising if it's right directly during the rut. But that stand assemblage is incredible. When it's all said and done, when you have that food source layering and you have the layered bedding effect, and you can scout that or create it on private land, scout it on public land, it gives you the opportunity for not only finding doe bedding, buck bedding, establishing good hunter access that takes advantage of knowing where those bedding areas are, where obviously the food source is, gives you that great stand assemblage, but most importantly, when you put it all together, it gives you a low pressure land potential. You can reach your potential. You can actually hunt that, get on and off the property like a predator when you have that layered doe bedding, when you have that layered buck bedding, because it gives you an assemblage of consistency every single year. You're not relying on the whims of the farming rotations around your property. That's why, like on this property, there is not one stitch of ag land on our land that'll ever be ag land again when we own it, because I want to convert that to high quality, consistent food sources, switchgrass, access, so that we can get in and out of our property. And I would never buy a property with ag and just rent it out. I'd just buy a smaller property that I could be more efficient with. For me anyways, that's the way I look at it. But that layered doe bedding, taking advantage of that consistency every year, that consistent access where you know you're not going to spook deer, you can refine that every single year. And then ultimately you get to experience what most hunters do not get to experience in the hunting world. And that's a low pressure property. You can certainly reach its potential then, and you can be the herd influencer in the neighborhood. I encourage each one of you to try that and look at these possibilities for this year. I know this looks like a big giant mess now, but if you think of this layered effect for deer bedding and you take that to the woods with you to scout this fall or this summer on public land, or you apply this to your own private land, when you put this together with the annual whitetail shift concept, the fact that you can create doe factories during the summer, and how you should manage your timber and your habitat based on perpendicular access so you can get in and out of your land without spooking deer, putting those pieces together, then you can create not only a great hunt on private land, but you can do the same on public land. My first book, Whitetail Success by Design, a lot of people don't realize, they thought it was more of a private land book because that's what I was into. This came out in 2012, and I'd been writing articles for years about private land. The intro and conclusion, this will be a spoiler alert, so leave if you don't want to, if you haven't read the book, but the intro and conclusion revolve around a public land hunt in the UP in Michigan. I talk about all the concepts of doe layering, depth of cover, and buck bedding versus doe bedding, food source movement, baiting out in the woods, and then using that depth to where I was at, perpendicular access into stand locations so I'm not spooking deer. All the concepts I talk about, and you know, people thought this hunt was private land. In the conclusion, I revealed that it's a actual public land hunt way out in the middle of nowhere. It's the same concepts, whether it's private or public land. You have to apply hunting skill and advanced hunting tactics to put it all together. I think a lot of people do a lot better job on public land than they do their own private land, because on public land, they just need to find it, recognize it, hunt smart, which you know you're not blowing the wind into the movement, into the food source. Private land, it seems like people mess it all up. I don't know if that's cable TV shows, you're putting a blind right out in the middle of the food plot, but you have to apply that high degree of hunting. I encourage you to check out my web class, How to Design a Whitetail Parcel, if you haven't done so already. We're getting some great feedback on that. It'd be great to hear from you. And you know, going forward, try to put these pieces together. Think about that layered doe bedding and deer bedding and buck bedding as it relates to your scout this summer or fall, and you're going to have a great hunt this deer season.